Hey there, you sexy beast. I hope you've brought your Stamina X and your favorite dragon amulet, because today we're going to talk about the other side of the Like a Dragon franchise, that being the other side of the coin to the Yakuza, that being the police. So sit back, relax, and if you like this video, then feel free to check out my whole playlist of other Yakuza videos. So, let's get into it. When the franchise started back in 2005, a pretty interesting thing about it is how one of the most prominent characters is a cop, that being everyone's favorite detective Makoto Date, the Dilf of Tokyo PD, if you will. And Date is a fan favorite character for a reason. He's a very close character to Kiryu, one of the few people to be considered his best friend. And from the start in Yakuza 1, where they started off in a rough place because, well, they were on opposite sides, and Date essentially lost his rank due to exploring and trying to figure out the truth behind Kiryu's case in the Dojima murder. And over the course of Yakuza 1, their dynamic develops to become bros, and they both become entangled in a plot that was 10 years in the making in the form of the 10 billion yen incident. Then over the course of Yakuza 2 and 3, we get a lot more of Date. We see him develop. We get to see his relationship between other characters, such as Killer Kurara and Yakuza 2, who he kind of plays off of. A bit of an older mentor figure to Date in a sense, just in the form of his legacy on the force. And there's one thing I really like about Yakuza 1's plot, where it takes a little break from the story and lets you do some other objectives, such as helping Date and the florist reconcile in a way with their estranged kids. We get a really sweet moment of Date and his daughter sort of making amends thanks to the help of Kiryu. And I like that little story is able to tie into the overall plot, bit of foreshadowing between Kiryu and Haruka. And then in Yakuza 3 we get a nice other side story where Kiryu helps Date save Mariko, the new mama of, well, new Serena. It's a nice little sub-story that I'm glad it got its own little animated spotlight. And this little story helps sort of show Date's other motivations, that he's still trying to live a bit of a normal life. You know, he has his own goals besides the force, and, you know, regaining his position as a legendary detective. And here we get to see how far Date is willing to go to save Mariko from figures from her past. I like that this little sub-story pays off in later games, such as in 4, where Date's taken over for new Serena while Mariko's on vacation. Then, you know, she pops up in 5 and 6, and 6 is revealed that her and Date, well, they tied the knot and got married. So I just like how Date, he's a really nice sort of parallel to Kiryu, because he's a cop on the opposite side, while Kiryu's an ex-Yakuza. You know, when you look at Yakuza 1, they're both sort of expedited from their respective groups, and they're just trying to do their own thing. I like that. It shows how it's not really, doesn't matter what side we're on, it just matters what we're really fighting for. I think that the dynamic, the bromance between Kiryu and Date really encapsulates that. I mean, who doesn't love to see the big, tough Yakuza guy and his tired, worn-out detective buddy team up to take on the bad guys, huh? It's good stuff. And the latter half of Yakuza 6 and 8 do a great job showing the bond between Kiryu, Date, and all the other characters around them, showing how far Date is willing to go to risk his life looking out for Kiryu. I just really like that. It's a lot of good emotional payoffs for the series, even if you didn't really expect it coming. So all in all, Date is a great character, and we can all understand why he's a fan favorite. He's one of my favorites, of course. And Date is just a really charming character. He's got that bit of a sleazy detective vibe who's always tired, but he's willing to step up and get the job done when the time comes. And while he may be a bit of a grouchy detective who's been on the force for too long, you know he's got a big heart of gold. And before I move on to the next character, I do want to briefly mention Junichi Sudo, who appeared in Yakuza 1 to Yakuza 4 from what I can recall. He's a bit of a minor character, but he was pretty prevalent in at least Yakuza 1 and 2. And he is a bit of a foil to Date, as he's more by the books, strict, and not really willing to go off the grid to solve problems. But I like that by the end of Yakuza 1 he comes around and helps Date in the helicopter. And he even appears for a little bit in Tanimura's part in 4. So, yeah, a little interesting other character when it comes to cops and Yakuza. So let's go ahead and move on and talk about our next character, Koichi Adachi, who first appeared in Yakuza 7 and is in Infinite Wealth and Ishin Kiwami. Yeah, I love this guy. He's another Dilf master, just like Date and Kamaki. I mean, what's not to love? He's another older detective. It probably smells like a bit of whiskey and coffee when you walk by him. But Adachi's great. He's funny, he's charming, and he can pack a punch. And he really, truly is Ichiban's equivalent to Date. I mean, really. And the fact that Adachi knows Date is great. A really great advantage Adachi has as a character is that you get to play as him during Yakuza 7 and 8. You know, he's in Ichiban's party, and he's a really fun character to explore. And like I said, well, he's a cop character, and that is translated to his gameplay. He's got that infinite handcuff technique you can use on a bunch of these Sujimon goons. You can pretty much incapacitate them and take them out of the fight in one hit if you're able to land it. It's such an overpowered mechanic that I didn't really truly have to use until like Yakuza 8, because you know, that game was harder than 7 for me at least. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I think that Adachi being a detective character really balances Ichiban's hero style and Namba's homeless wizard style. It's a really great just way to make the gameplay feel more enriched. And that also has contributed to Adachi as a character in the story. He was the first guy to join Ichiban's party, and we all know that scene where Ichiban gets out of prison. He gets that iconic hairdo, and Adachi's in the truck laughing at him from the window. It's good stuff. And much like Date, Adachi brings a bit of a logical lens to Ichiban's adventures, as an example to help deduce and bring a little bit of context to what the law enforcement side is doing and the whole sort of crime investigations that go into the plots of these games. He's a good way to kind of help leverage our protagonist Ichiban into the real world. And I found it interesting that of all the characters to get a mirror face clone towards the end of Yakuza 7, it was Adachi. That was interesting. We get a little classic trope where your buddy has a quote-unquote clone and trying to figure out who's who. And yeah, it was interesting that Adachi was the one picked for that. It kind of shows how far the whole group had bonded towards the course of Yakuza 7 alone. And when it comes to Adachi's true place in the plot, what is really interesting to me that I don't feel like a lot of people talk about is that of all these sort of secondary scheming antagonists in the franchise, Adachi's main antagonist was taken out in the end credit scene. A pretty long, beefy cutscene, mind you, but I still find that interesting. Because by the time Yakuza 7 wraps up and the credits roll, you just pretty much forget about this guy. And who am I talking about? I'm talking about the police commissioner of Tokyo PD, Jiro Hunorichi. Yeah, hopefully you remembered him too. Now, he is an okay villain, but the fact that we had a bad guy who was the police commissioner, we didn't get to actually fight him, I think is a missed opportunity in Yakuza 7. But regardless, 7 already had a bunch of great villains. I just think that maybe Hunorichi could have been in a sequel game, but looks like he won't be. But he was integral to Adachi's story, as well as Masato Arakawa's. You see that Hunorichi was the guy who partnered up with Arakawa in the Omi Alliance. He took bribes from them, and the fact that he took bribes and did other nefarious deeds throughout the 20 years he was rising up through the force is what ultimately leads to his downfall, where Adachi's able to bring the receipts and pull him down once and for all, and he gives him a nice speech to boot. But to back up a bit, back in the day, Hunorichi was Adachi's superior, and when Hunorichi was not stopping at all costs to make sure he got all the promotions he wanted, he made sure that there was this case where a guy named Kasumi was falsely accused of murdering a couple, and therefore sentenced to 17 years in prison. And Hunorichi did this because he didn't want anyone to realize that he made a mistake and did not want a scandal. And of course, Adachi wanted to stick it to his superior and say, hey, this is not right. But Adachi was demoted to DMV and had to work as a driving instructor for years. And as you would see in Adachi's life link in the bar in Yakuza 7, he would send money to Kasumi's son over the years, trying to help him. And I think this just shows how much of a caring person that Adachi is, and that he's always willing to do what's right. And I do think that him having a sort of antagonist in the form of Hunorichi is pretty interesting. It shows that Adachi really was a just a major character in 7. And while Infinite Wealth has a bunch going on and Adachi mostly reappears just to be a badass returning character, I'm very happy he was placed in Ichiban's party. It just seems right. And so all in all, Adachi is a badass. He's a calculating, logical thinker, and he's got a lot of charm and just coolness to him that you gotta love. He's like the definition of fine whiskey, right? Alright, let's move on to our next character. That being Kaoru Sayama. And yeah, she's pretty damn hot. What? I got more to say. I had to say that. Anyway, yeah, so Legs over here is a really good character in Yakuza 2. And I do think that she shows what the newer law enforcement generation was going to be like. As you can see in her introduction in Yakuza 2, she was the Yakuza Huntress, or the Yakuza Eater according to the original PS2 translation, but it's a pretty striking introduction. She uses a wooden katana and she's really sticking it to this Osaka Yakuza guy. And it kind of shows how, at this point, yeah, the Yakuza really were kind of starting to meet their end in the 21st century, slowly but surely. And with Sayama, you just kind of get this sense of she's doing what she thinks is justice, she's trying to do the right thing, and she's really not going to let anyone stick it to her. I know some people like to claim that Yakuza apparently can't write women, but that's just not true. I mean, they just write people who are human, that's all there is to it. And it's perfectly okay if Sayama shows some weakness later on in the story. Just made her feel more relatable, like any other character. Now that being said, I do really like her story, because not only is it kind of an interesting way to kind of shed light on Kiryu this early in the series, like, yeah, she pretty much was his, sugar mama in this game, but she also was a way to kind of bring out Kiryu's lighthearted side, and just the part of him that, needed to live, because he was in prison for a decade. And I do like that, they both kind of add to each other. And another thing is how, when I first played Yakuza 2, I didn't expect her to tie into my favorite antagonist, Ryuji Goda. And I really like how the fact that they didn't even know they were related for their entire lives, when push came to shove and it turned out they ended up looking out for each other instead of just, rejecting their bond. And I do think that's pretty interesting. It shows how, she's part of the police, and then there's all these Yakuza guys like Ryuji, but even though they're both on different sides, they're both just these really human characters trying to make their way in the world. And this same sentiment applies to the other revelation in the plot, where it's revealed that that old detective I mentioned earlier, Killer Kawara, was actually Sayama's real biological father. It's a really heartbreaking scene in Yakuza 2, and I just think it really highlights how much development her character went through, as with other characters in the series going through their own revelations and figuring out the past wasn't what they thought it was. Yeah, I think it's still a powerful moment. And another interesting thing about Sayama is that, yeah, she gets to fight alongside Kiryu. I thought that was such a great addition to the gameplay, and it really spiced things up. Because if you're going to have a character be helping Kiryu throughout the story, then you might as well have him fight alongside him, right? And it's cool seeing her fight, because, they showed how much she's willing to put force up against the Yakuza in her introduction cutscene. So yeah, she can fight, and she's part of the law enforcement. Once again, we get that sort of parallel between cops and Yakuza having to work together, which I'll bring up later, and a certain antagonist in the later end of this video, but yeah, she's a nice parallel to Kiryu. And then we also get her lighthearted side, such as when she breaks that golf club and the golf dating scene, or when she calls Kiryu and tells him to buy her beer and underwear. There's also the bit where she's a bit of a motherly figure to Haruka, which I thought was a nice touch. They have that little moment in the car before the big fight on the highway. So all in all, I thought Sayama was another great character in addition to the Yakuza series. She shows how much the cops themselves are evolving to take on the Yakuza threat, and I'm happy that in 8, they left the door open for her and Kiryu to finally tie the knot. And maybe Kiryu can finally take a note from Date and Mariko. Alright, let's talk about the final major character in this video and his ancillary characters too. That being Masayoshi Tanimura, the incarnation of justice itself, and a fellow Thai brother I might add. Tanimura not only kicks ass, he parries it too. And I was pleasantly surprised during my first playthrough of Yakuza 4 years ago to see that he was the guy who got to have the final boss of the game. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But Tanimura is a tremendously awesome addition to the Yakuza series. And I've done a recent Legend playthrough with my brother who captured some of the footage for me here. Thanks, bro. And Tanimura, he's really cool. We get to see his perspective as not only being a cop, well, more specifically a community safety officer, which I do think is a really cool idea for him, because it kind of separates him from other cops, not just by who he is as an individual, of course, but kind of like his certain rank he has or the division he wants to be in. And I think him being a community safety officer ties into a very integral part of his story, that being he's the parasite of Kamurocho. But not in a bad way. You see, he's able to deal with the shady people while also looking out for the community. And by doing these dealings, he's able to seed out who's truly wicked. And I like that this ties into him protecting the other Asian communities of Tokyo, that being Little Asia and Kamurocho. I really think it helps add some context to Kamurocho's history, because if you remember, in Yakuza 2 we get the Jingwan massacre of the 80s. And then we get some other context retroactively in Yakuza 0 when you of course visit Little Asia in that game and you get to learn a bit more from the Elder with how the foreign communities were impacted by the Yakuza. And I do think that Tanimura being a protector for them is a really fascinating idea, because you have these intricate alleyways that are not so much different from, say, the sewers or the rooftops, but they have their own identity to them. You have this community of people from all over Asia having a conglomerate here in the heart of Tokyo. And these alleys are just sandwiched between North Pink Street and Seiryu Avenue. And Tanimura will do whatever it takes to ensure that the kids in Little Asia have money to live off of, whether that means he has to do illegal gambling or other means. He also looks out for any foreign workers coming to the country that are adults. And as we see in one of his introduction cutscenes where we get this brilliant tracking shot as he goes through Little Asia and he talks to some worker there. It's just interesting seeing how he's able to interact with this community, including his main buddy, Zhao, who's in charge of the restaurant with his daughter. And I just really like this. It helps kind of ground Kamurocho in a different light. While if Akiyama was a guy who lived in the top of a building pretty much with a bunch of money, and Saejima was an outsider breaking into Kamurocho, then I like that Tanimura was the guy who was always positioned there. So Yakuza 4's story of Tanimura is that he's trying to figure out what happened to his adopted father, Taigi Tanimura, back in 1985 following the Una Sewa hit. So Tanimura's story is one about trying to find justice and also developing his own sense of it as well, from trying to figure out what happened back in the day and trying to see how far up this corruption goes up the ladder when Tanimura has to fight one of his superiors, Junji Suguchi. And he gets to see just how much corruption there truly was and how far it dates back. And yeah, we get the great boat chase at the docks, then an awesome fist fight with Suguchi himself, with a brilliant dynamic intro and boss theme to boot. And what really always stuck out to me is the following cutscene right before Suguchi dies. He pretty much goes from really just being awful at Tanimura to kind of letting go and just really opening up to how Suguchi has spent his entire life being a Yakuza as a spy on the police force. So we get this interesting revelation of a Yakuza acting like a cop. And you really start to feel for Suguchi because he spent decades being someone he's not. And as he spills his guts out to Tanimura, he mentions how whenever he had to do these actual cases, to keep up the charade, he actually felt good solving these cases and putting bad people away and helping others, which was really interesting to me. As you all know, Yakuza is a series that I think should get more praise for how many villains it develops that you actually start to feel some empathy for. Not necessarily sympathy, but at least empathy for how they got there and how it ended. And yeah, I think Suguchi's a great example of that. And sadly, he gets taken out by an assassin, but he reveals to Tanimura that there's more to the force going on than he thought. And so this allows Tanimura to continue his quest with the help of the other characters to take on the Deputy Commissioner of Tokyo PD himself, Seishiro Munakata. Django 2.0, not just in a gameplay sense, but if you remember, this very interesting part of 4's plot is that Munakata's plot ties back into Django from Yakuza 1, where the 10 billion was going to be used to help create a quote-unquote correctional facility for the Yakuza so the police could control crime themselves. I think that having Tanimura go up and fight the Deputy Commissioner himself is a great way to end his story. And it really is just a great finale. He has to go up against an entire fleet of elite police officers, and then he has to fight Munakata himself. And it's just amazing. You know, this really is like the definition of 4 faith, and I really like how Tanimura is this cop. You know, he's a pretty low-ranking cop, all things considered. He's the parasite of Kamurocho, and he's able to look out for his community and team up with all these other major characters to help save the day and solve this dramatic plot, and ensuring that the police themselves do not step out of line, take over the Yakuza. Sure, it may be some foreshadowing in the future with the Kamurocho 3K plan, but in the context of just Tanimura's story alone, I think it's awesome how he's able to prevail above these heinous actions that were tainted from the past and bled into the present. So Tanimura is generally a spectacular character in addition to Yakuza. And the only sad thing about this is the way Little Asia ended up by the end of Yakuza 6, and according to Infinite Wealth, Little Asia still hasn't been fully rebuilt. But hopefully RG is holding off for a big reveal of Little Asia. I mean, in 8 we finally got a solid, genuine acknowledgement of Tanimura himself from Kiryu in his memoirs. And as we saw in 7 and 8, Tanimura's notebook lives on in the form of this vintage notebook talking about justice, and we all know who that's about. So, Tanimura, he's out there somewhere, and since he already has a new actor in the 4 remaster, then I'm sure he's going to come back eventually, right? If you look at 8, and they truly brought back some deep cuts of characters with voice acting too, I'm sure we're going to see Tanimura sooner than later. In conclusion, today I talked about the many cop and law enforcement characters of the Like a Dragon franchise. Characters I think are integral to the plot, because of course these are games about, well, crime and these dramatic plots that are soap operas in themselves. So I do think that these cop characters are important. They're the other side of the coin to the Yakuza themselves, but they also provide a fresh insight into the world around them and how it doesn't really matter what group or what side you're on. There can always be bad people and good people and legends that rise out of both. So, thank you guys so much for watching. I've been Tiger Drop Films, and please let me know in the comments what your favorite characters from today's video is. Please go off. I want to hear your thoughts. So, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and feel free to check out my other Yakuza videos. Until then, take care, and I'll see ya in the next one. Tiger Drop Films, out.